They laughed at him. Right there in the federal courthouse. 3 cops in uniform, their voices echoing off marble like cheap bravado. They didn't know the man they mocked ran the bureau that could end their careers with a phone call. He just sat there motionless, watching them write their own indictment one laugh at a time. The laughter carried through the corridor like static, sharp and thin in the air, scrubbed too clean. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing everything in that colorless glow bureaucracies favored. The shade of exhaustion mistaken for justice. The marble floor gleamed so bright it looked wet. Every sound, every word ricocheted. He sat on a wooden bench positioned exactly between 2 flags, one national, one state, the symmetry of order masking the rot beneath it. His posture was deliberate, upright, hands folded loosely in his lap, a picture of patience that came from decades of discipline. The badge in his inner pocket pressed against his ribs, its cold edge a constant reminder of what he chose not to reveal. The officer's laughter lowered into a rhythm, the lazy cadence of men confident in their authority. "Look at that suit," one said. "They always overdress for arraignments, like fabric's gonna save them." Another answered, "Bet he's corporate, or something white-collar. They get that polite look when they're scared." He didn't flinch. His eyes remained on the glass wall ahead, where the courthouse emblem, a blindfolded woman balancing her scales, hovered in reflection. Her face was serene, detached, the illusion of fairness etched in frosted glass. They kept talking. Not loudly, not enough to provoke a report, just enough to confirm what the system allowed them to be. Their voices blended with the fluorescent buzz, 2 frequencies of the same cruelty. A clerk passed with a stack of files. The papers whispered as they shifted in her arms, names and charges sealed inside. The man followed her with his eyes until she turned a corner, swallowed by the courthouse's indifferent geometry. The hallway smelled of disinfectant, cold metal, and the faint trace of coffee from some distant office. It was the scent of an institution that prided itself on hygiene, not justice. Clean hands, dirty conscience. The man adjusted his cuff. The motion was quiet, contained. Even the movement of his wrist spoke fluently in the language of restraint. He could end this farce with a word, with the display of a small circular badge that had silenced senators and generals alike. But power, real power, didn't perform for small men. It waited. One of the officers opened a soda can. The sound hissed through the corridor, vulgar in its casualness. "You think he's guilty?" he asked, smirking. The other shrugged. "They all are. Some just got better lawyers." He heard every word. Let it settle, like evidence being logged. He studied their faces reflected in the glass, blurry shapes distorted by light. Arrogance had a shape. It was predictable, procedural. He checked his watch. Not because he was impatient, but because time here felt engineered to slow dignity down. Bureaucratic time wasn't meant to move forward. It looped, feeding itself, grinding patience into silence. The courtroom door opened at the end of the hall. A woman's voice called his name, crisp and formal. "Mr. Harlan?" He rose. The sound of the bench creaked, small, human, almost intimate in the otherwise sterile corridor. The officers stopped talking. Their eyes followed him now, the laughter dying in their throats. Something in his posture shifted the air, authority expressed without a word. The liaison waited at the door, holding a folder close to her chest. Her badge caught the light. "The judge will see you now," she said. He nodded once. "Thank you." As he passed the officers, one straightened reflexively. The other dropped his gaze, pretending to check his phone. It was instinct, not remorse. The instinct of men who sensed hierarchy but couldn't read it. He paused at the courtroom door, his hand resting briefly on the handle. The glass wall beside him mirrored his figure, composed, symmetrical, untouchable. His reflection stood beside the courthouse emblem, the blindfolded woman, both staring forward into the same light. His fingers brushed the badge through the fabric of his pocket. The metal was cool against his skin, a reminder of who he was and of the system that still couldn't see it. He pushed the door open. The laughter behind him did not resume. The corridor settled into silence again, cold, bright, and self-satisfied. Above the bench where he had waited, the glass emblem caught a flicker of fluorescent light, her scales balanced in perfect indifference. And as the door closed behind him, the building, ancient in habit, modern in excuse, returned to what it did best. It forgot. The hearing had not yet begun, but the cruelty had already found its rhythm. It started as sound, a murmur, a smirk disguised as conversation, the low electric buzz of confidence unchecked. The three officers stood by the vending machine again, their uniforms creased with the comfort of ownership. Their laughter traveled in half-sentences and glances, coded enough to survive deniability, loud enough to remind the corridor who belonged. The marble walls carried their voices like confession, echoing unrepentant. He sat across from them, the same position as before, hands folded, spine straight, silence measured to the second. His stillness disturbed them more than any outburst could. One officer leaned on the machine, tapping a coin against it idly. See that? All calm. That's the kind of calm that comes from practice. They teach that in seminars now, how to behave in court. The others chuckled. Yeah, another said. Half of them act like CEOs, but then they can't even pay bail. The sound of laughter slid through the vents above, thin and metallic. It mixed with the constant hum of the lights, that same high-pitched tone that never stopped, like the building itself was sighing in exhaustion. He didn't move, didn't look, only adjusted the way his thumb pressed against his palm, a small movement but deliberate. His control was complete. The stillness became something heavier than silence. It became surveillance. Power expressed itself differently in this place. For them it was noise, laughter, motion, the performance of authority. For him, it was the ability to stay absolutely still. They mistook that quiet for weakness. He knew it for what it was. Restraint weaponized. The clerk from earlier returned, her heels clicking rhythmically. She didn't glance at the officers, but her shoulders tightened as she passed them, as if the air near their laughter carried a static charge. The sound of her footsteps was swallowed quickly by the corridor's distance. The man watched her go. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted toward the officers. Not directly, just enough, a single second too long. One of them noticed and smiled, the kind of smile that claimed victory over discomfort. Something funny, sir. He blinked once, then looked away. No answer. That silence hit harder than any insult could. It forced their own words to echo back at them, stripped of power. The officer laughed again, but quieter now, unsure whether the joke still belonged to him. Guess not, he muttered. The others went still. The corridor felt longer. Even the air vents seemed to hold their breath. A phone buzzed somewhere. One officer took it out, pretended to scroll, then whispered something the others barely caught. Another small laugh. Forced this time. The man sat with his eyes lowered, not submissive but analytical, reading posture, tone, the spaces between words. He had made a career of decoding silence. Now he used that same skill to absorb their contempt. Every gesture went into the mental file he was building, not on them, but on the institution that produced them. The hum of the fluorescent lights deepened as if the building itself was listening. He flexed his fingers once, slow, careful. The skin across his knuckles caught the cold light. Hands that had signed orders, reviewed surveillance footage, shaped federal directives. Hands that could move entire departments into action. And here they were, folded and still, like a verdict withheld. The officers resumed their small performance, louder again now, emboldened by their own forgetfulness. One mimicked a courtroom voice. "Your Honor, I swear it wasn't me." The others laughed. The sound bounced down the corridor, met glass, and returned thinner, uglier. He breathed in through his nose, the air metallic and dry. Every exhale felt like an act of containment. He thought of the badge, still in his pocket, still silent. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't a symbol of who he was. It was proof of what they weren't. A janitor appeared at the far end of the hall, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. He paused when he saw the group, uncertain whether he should pass. The officers ignored him mid-laughter. The man lifted his gaze, met the janitor's eyes for a brief moment, and nodded once. Permission, recognition, humanity. The janitor nodded back and moved on, wheels squeaking softly over tile. When the sound faded, silence returned, denser, heavier than before. The laughter had thinned into discomfort. The officers shifted their weight. One cleared his throat. Another checked his watch. The energy was gone. The man had said nothing, but the hierarchy had reversed itself quietly, invisibly. He leaned back slightly on the bench, exhaling through his nose. The stillness was no longer defense. It was dominion. The liaison appeared again at the end of the hall, her voice calm but brisk. "Mr. Harlan, we're almost ready for you." He stood. The officers straightened instinctively, like men caught in the wrong posture at inspection. The liaison held the door open. He walked past them slowly, not looking at their faces, not acknowledging their existence. He didn't need to. They already felt it, the slow erosion of their confidence under the pressure of his silence. The corridor behind him echoed faintly with the remnants of laughter, weak and hollow now, swallowed by the air vents. As the door closed, the fluorescent lights flickered once. The hum resumed, steady and unbroken, and in that sterile hallway where authority was supposed to be loud, silence had won. The courtroom was colder than the corridor, not by temperature, by design. Here the air carried hierarchy. Every chair, every light, every inch of wood had been placed to remind those inside who held the power and who was meant to yield to it. He stepped through the door, escorted by the liaison. The sound of it closing behind him felt final, almost ceremonial, the kind of silence that didn't just end conversation but erased it. Rows of benches stretched across the room, empty except for a few scattered observers, a court clerk with downcast eyes, a security officer by the side door, a reporter pretending not to take notes. At the center, raised above the rest, sat the judge, his expression neutral in the way only long tenure could teach. The neutrality of someone who had practiced detachment until it became instinct. The man took his seat at the defense table. The wooden surface gleamed under the overhead light, a single cone of illumination so harsh it flattened color. Beneath it everything looked grayscale, including his skin. The prosecutor shuffled papers on the opposite side. His gestures were rehearsed, crisp, deliberate, meant to convey confidence without aggression. Bureaucratic theater, every motion built to look procedural, inevitable. The judge spoke without looking up. Case number 2214B, United States versus... He paused, scanning the page. Mr. Jonathan Harlan. The sound of his name lingered. The room swallowed it whole. Harlan kept his gaze fixed forward, not on the judge, not on the prosecutor, but on the great seal mounted above the bench. It dominated the wall, an eagle clutching arrows in one talon, an olive branch in the other. Its wings stretched across a circular field of stars, a symbol of authority so familiar it had lost meaning. The seal gleamed under recessed lighting, a perfect artifact of faith in structure. But in that sterile glow it looked hollow, like a monument to an ideal no one remembered how to live. The prosecutor began reading. His tone was careful, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion. Mr. Harlan is charged with obstruction of local law enforcement, misuse of jurisdictional authority, and conduct unbecoming of a federal officer. Each phrase landed without weight. The words sounded less like accusation than procedure being performed for its own sake. The man's eyes traced the room instead, the angles of the cameras mounted high on the walls, the way the light haloed around the judge's head, the reflection of his own hands against the polished table. Every object here was evidence, not of crime but of system, how authority performed itself under the pretense of order. The judge finally looked up. "Mr. Harlan, do you understand the charges?" "I do." His voice cut cleanly through the space, low, steady, unhurried, the sound of a man who'd testified before oversight committees and congressional panels, who'd learned that calm was the most dangerous form of confidence. The prosecutor continued, stacking his pages like ammunition. "This hearing is preliminary. The goal today is simply to establish..." Harlan's gaze drifted back to the flag standing in the corner. Its edges were perfectly straight, no movement, no breath. The stars on the blue field glinted under artificial light. Symbolic perfection, sterilized. He'd seen the same flag on podiums, briefing rooms, caskets. It never changed, only the people beneath it did. The judge nodded for the prosecutor to continue. "We have reports that Mr. Harlan interfered with an ongoing investigation conducted by local law enforcement officers, so using federal authority without proper coordination." Harlan's fingers interlocked loosely on the table. The gesture was exact, symmetrical, deliberate. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He let the performance play out, noting every inflection, every word chosen for bureaucratic precision. He'd written language like this himself. He knew how accusations were built, not from truth but from phrasing. The clerk typed steadily, each keystroke echoing in the hollow room. It was the sound of a system recording itself. The judge's expression didn't shift. His neutrality had calcified into something close to indifference. He wasn't listening to meaning, only rhythm. The ritual of authority comforted him. The prosecutor adjusted his tie and asked, "Does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Harlan lifted his eyes. Not at this time. The pause between each word was surgical. He knew timing, how silence could carry further than speech. The prosecutor nodded, trying not to show relief. The judge leaned back, chair creaking faintly. "Very well. The court will proceed with review of documentation submitted by local authorities." Another shuffle of papers. Another practiced exchange. The sound filled the void like static. From the corner, one of the officers from the corridor shifted. The faint creak of leather carried through the room. Harlan noticed, not with anger but with clinical precision. The sound reminded him that men like that were never far from the center of power, only a few steps behind it. Guarding the door, laughing in the hall, he exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the edge of the polished table for a brief second before vanishing. The gesture was almost invisible, but it steadied him. When the prosecutor finished his summary, the judge closed the file. This court will reconvene upon confirmation of jurisdictional authority. A sentence that meant nothing and everything. Delay as procedure. The gavel came down softly, no drama, no finality. Just another step in a process designed to look like movement while standing perfectly still. The liaison came forward. "This way, Mr. Harlan." He rose, buttoned his jacket, and followed her toward the side door. As he walked, his eyes lifted once more to the national seal above the bench. The eagle's gaze stared outward, unblinking, its talons gripping symbols of peace and war in equal measure. It was meant to inspire confidence. Instead, it looked trapped, frozen mid-flight, unable to land anywhere clean. The lights flickered once. No one noticed. Outside the door, the corridor waited. Same hum, same pale air, same unending cleanliness. He adjusted his cufflinks before stepping back into it. The gesture wasn't vanity. It was armor. Each click of his shoes against marble sounded measured, mathematical. Behind him, the courtroom lights dimmed. The seal faded into shadow, and the sound of the gavel, small, hollow, echoed once more through the vents before dissolving into silence. Justice had spoken its lines, and, as always, it had said nothing. Recess was announced with the soft thud of the gavel, a pause disguised as mercy. The courtroom emptied into the corridor, voices scattering like debris in the fluorescent light. The same corridor, the same sterile hum, the same polished surfaces that made every motion look rehearsed. Harlan stepped out last. His expression didn't change. His breathing didn't shift. He walked with the slow precision of a man who had spent his life measured against protocol. The liaison gestured politely toward the benches, but he shook his head and remained standing, hands behind his back. The officers were already there. The same three from before, leaning against the glass wall now, their reflections doubled, bodies overlapping, laughter mirrored. They had loosened their posture, freed from the brief confinement of courtroom etiquette. The laughter began almost immediately, quieter than before but sharper. "Man, did you see the look on his face when the judge called his name?" one of them said. Another answered, "Yeah, they always try to play calm, like they read about it in some self-help book." They laughed again, short bursts, controlled, the kind that expected complicity from the air. The corridor responded only with the low mechanical hum of the vents. Harlan didn't look at them. His eyes moved instead to the far end of the hall, where sunlight tried to cut through the glass but failed. The reflections swallowed the light, leaving only a pale suggestion of warmth. "Think he's one of those white-collar protest types," another officer said, lowering his voice but not enough. "You know, the system's broken crowd, always preaching while they're on trial," the first officer chuckled. "He's got that look. Quiet, educated, probably thinks he's too good for cuffs." A pause, then, "Bet he talks real polite when he gets pulled over." Laughter again. The sound was thinner now, stripped of joy. It clung to the corners of the hallway like condensation. Harlan's reflection in the glass stared back at him, precise, calm, eyes darker under the fluorescent glare. The reflection was steady even when the real man shifted slightly, one hand brushing his pocket. The badge was still there, silent, untouched. The third officer lifted his phone. "Gotta send this to Martinez," he said, angling the camera toward Harlan. The click of the photo broke the stillness like a gunshot muffled under bureaucracy. The flash bounced off the glass, cutting through the reflection, momentarily blinding it. "Hey," one of the others hissed, "don't, it's just a picture." "Nobody cares." But the laugh that followed was forced. The sound of the shutter echoed once through the vent, then died in static. Harlan turned his head slightly, just enough for the officers to feel seen. His eyes were calm, not confrontational, not pleading, observing, evaluating like a man recording testimony. No words came. He didn't need them. Silence pressed against the corridor walls, filling every gap between the officers' breaths. One of them coughed, the sound sharp, involuntary. Another shifted his stance, looking anywhere but at him. The laughter had run out of places to go. Harlan's gaze returned to the glass wall. His reflection looked cleaner than the men behind him, as though the glass itself refused to replicate their smirks. The national emblem above the courtroom door shimmered faintly, distorted by the reflection of the overhead lights. The eagle blurred, its wings half erased. He could hear the faint buzz of conversation from inside the courtroom, voices layered over the constant hum of ventilation. The machinery of justice warming itself back up. Behind him, one of the officers muttered, quieter now. "He's just staring at the wall." "Yeah," said another. "Creepy, isn't it?" A brittle laugh. The third said nothing this time. Harlan breathed in. The air was recycled metallic. He could taste the chemicals of sterilization. He'd smelled that same sterile air in interrogation rooms, in morgues, in places where truth came second to procedure. He imagined saying something. One sentence, one name, one command that would rearrange their posture entirely. He imagined the way their faces would change when they understood. But imagination was indulgence. Power did not announce itself in anger. He remained silent. The light flickered once overhead, then steadied. The hum deepened, filling the silence with an almost mechanical heartbeat. The officer's conversation trailed off into half-sentences. A phone buzzed. A shoe squeaked. Their earlier confidence was dissolving under the weight of something they couldn't name. He adjusted his tie, slow, unhurried. The motion seemed to draw all their attention, a simple act but deliberate, controlled. The tie straightened perfectly, the knot tight against his collar. They looked at him now the way men look at an unexplained shadow, familiar shape, unfamiliar consequence. The liaison reappeared from the courtroom door. "Mr. Harlan," she said softly, "we're ready to resume." He nodded once. As he passed the officers, they stepped back slightly to make space. No one spoke. The phone that had taken his photo was still in one man's hand, screen dark, reflection faintly catching his own uneasy face. Harlan stopped for the briefest second beside them. The corridor filled with the sound of the vents again, constant, oppressive. He turned his head just enough for his voice to reach them. "Delete it." The officer froze. "Excuse me." His tone didn't rise. "The photo." For a moment no one moved. The silence thickened. Then the officer lowered his eyes, thumb pressing the screen. A faint digital chime. Deletion confirmed. "Thank you," Harlan said. He walked away. The glass walls mirrored his back as he entered the courtroom again. One man framed in 1,000 reflections, his image multiplying across the corridor. Behind him the officers stood motionless, laughter hollowed out, authority deflated. The hum of the lights filled the vacuum they left behind. For a moment, the corridor seemed to hold its breath, a sterile, fluorescent monument to the kind of cruelty that thrives only when unchallenged. Then the laughter returned, faint, mechanical, recorded somewhere deep in memory, already losing shape, and the building, indifferent as ever, kept the silence it had been built to serve. The courtroom was already half settled when the disturbance began. The hum of the fluorescent lights was steady, almost reassuring, the sound of a machine resuming its ritual. The judge had returned to the bench, the prosecutor to his posture of readiness, and the 3 officers had found their place against the back wall, trying to look invisible again. Harlan sat at the defense table, the same calm stillness wrapped around him. The air had the faint chill of overconditioned control, a temperature meant to suppress discomfort, and by extension, emotion. Then came the sound, a door opening too quickly, the sharp rhythm of shoes on marble, Not confident, but urgent. The clerk appeared. A young woman with files pressed against her chest, eyes wide but restrained. She moved swiftly to the bench and leaned toward the judge, whispering something that broke the room's symmetry. Her voice was too soft to catch, but her urgency wasn't. The judge frowned, a slight crease at the edge of his mouth, almost imperceptible. But in a room built on controlled expressions, that movement carried weight. He held out a hand. She placed a folder in it. The paper passed between them like a contagion. The judge opened it. The sound of paper, dry, deliberate, echoed louder than it should have. The courtroom waited. Even the vents seemed to hush. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shifted in his seat, watching the exchange with a curiosity he tried to disguise as patience. The judge's eyes moved down the page once, then again. His jaw tightened, the slow, visible kind of tightening that belongs to someone realizing a mistake, one that can't be corrected without witness. Where did this come from? He asked quietly. The clerk hesitated. Direct request, Your Honor. Federal clearance confirmation from the Bureau. The word Bureau landed like a dissonant note. The prosecutor leaned forward. Your Honor. The judge didn't answer. He turned another page, scanning, lips tightening further. The silence stretched. Every person in that room could feel something shifting. Not loud, not visible, but tectonic. The officers at the back exchanged glances. The tallest of them, the one who'd laughed the loudest, folded his arms now as if the gesture could create a barrier between him and the growing uncertainty. The judge cleared his throat. Clerk, he said softly, are you certain this is authentic? Yes, Your Honor. It came through the department's secure line. Harlan remained perfectly still. His gaze didn't lift. His fingers traced an invisible pattern on the surface of the table. Small, rhythmic, deliberate. A movement that looked like thought but was closer to calculation. The judge set the papers down, aligning their edges too neatly. Then he looked up, really looked, at the man sitting before him. The expression in his eyes changed. Not recognition exactly, not yet, but the faint tremor of possibility. He adjusted his glasses, voice tighter now. Mr. Harlan, would you please confirm your full title for the record? The prosecutor frowned. Your Honor, I don't see how— Silence, counsel. The words landed with unexpected force. The courtroom stilled. Harlan lifted his eyes. For the first time that day, his gaze met the judge's directly. He spoke calmly. Jonathan Elias Harlan, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sentence fell into the silence like an object dropped into deep water, vanishing without sound, but leaving visible ripples. The prosecutor blinked, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. The clerk stood frozen beside the bench, papers clutched tighter to her chest. The officers at the back straightened without meaning to, instinct pulling them upright before thought caught up. The judge's lips parted, then closed again. His voice, when it came, was smaller. See. Harlan inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not pride. His expression didn't shift. The air in the room changed. You could feel it. A rearranging of gravity, a correction of orbit. The hierarchy that had shaped every interaction until this moment was suddenly reversed, and everyone present was struggling to breathe inside it. The prosecutor finally found his voice. Your Honor, this must be a misunderstanding. The paperwork, Harlan interrupted, was filed correctly. His tone was soft, but it silenced the room again. This hearing was approved by my office. I wanted to observe the system unannounced. The judge stared at him, mouth barely moving. Observe? Yes. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The conduct of law enforcement and court personnel during federal cooperation. Hearings. He let the silence sit after that, long. Enough for it to become unbearable. The officers at the back were motionless now. One of them swallowed audibly. Another shifted his weight, the sound of leather creaking like confession. The judge cleared his throat again. Mr. Harlan, Director Harlan, if we had been informed, you weren't meant to be. Each word landed like a gavel. The clerk lowered her eyes. The prosecutor's fingers trembled slightly on the stack of papers before him. Harlan leaned back, exhaling once. Please, he said quietly, continue with your proceedings. But no one moved. The judge looked down at the papers again, pretending to read them, though his hands betrayed him, fingers tapping lightly. the rhythm uneven. Finally he spoke. "I believe, given this new information, the court will adjourn pending review." He struck the gavel once. The sound rang hollow, stripped of authority. The clerk gathered her files too quickly, fumbling one, bending to retrieve it. The prosecutor packed his briefcase with trembling precision. At the back, one of the officers whispered, "Jesus Christ." The other answered, "Don't. Just don't." The laughter that had once filled the corridor was gone now, replaced by the hum of the lights, steady and merciless. Harlan stood. He buttoned his jacket, the motion unhurried. As he walked toward the door, the reflection of the Great Seal shimmered once more above the bench. Under the changing light, the eagle's wings seemed to spread wider, reclaiming the room that had dared to cage it. He didn't look back. The door opened, then closed, leaving the judge staring at the space he'd occupied. Papers still lay scattered across the bench, papers that minutes ago had felt like authority. Now they looked weightless, almost absurd. The clerk stood in the corner, uncertain what to do. Outside, in the corridor of glass, the officers remained, pale, rigid, their reflections trembling in the polished surface. One still held the phone he'd used earlier, the black screen reflecting only his own unease. Inside, the judge's jaw tightened again, the small, human reflex of someone feeling the weight of their own complicity. The system had been seen, and for the first time it looked back. The silence that followed his exit did not feel empty. It had shape, weight. It filled the courtroom the way gas fills a sealed chamber, invisible, inescapable. The judge remained motionless for several seconds, eyes fixed on the papers before him, though he was no longer reading. The clerk still stood at the bench, file clutched in both hands, breath shallow. The prosecutor sat frozen, his pen balanced perfectly still between his fingers. Even the officers by the wall had stopped pretending not to exist. Then the clerk moved. A small human motion, a step closer to the bench. "The rustle of papers, Your Honor," she whispered. "I've verified it." The words trembled, but they were enough. The judge looked up, face pale beneath the courtroom's surgical lighting. "Verified?" She nodded, sliding one of the documents across the bench. A simple printout, black text against white, the bureaucratic language of certainty. "He is who he said he is. Director Jonathan Elias Harlan, appointed 2 years ago under federal oversight reform. His clearance file includes authorization for field observation under sealed conditions." The words unfolded like a confession. The prosecutor inhaled sharply, the sound brittle. He was observing us." The judge didn't answer. He read the header again, the official seal, the signature, the chain of authentication that left no room for doubt. Outside, through the glass wall, the corridor remained visible, the echo of movement, the reflection of uniforms, the faint hum of fluorescent light. The officers stared through it now, as though the glass might somehow absolve them if they didn't look away. One of them whispered, "Jesus." He heard everything. The other didn't respond. He just pressed his thumb into the seam of his cap, a gesture half instinct, half apology. The third leaned against the wall, eyes closed, as though waiting for an impact that hadn't yet arrived. Inside the room, the judge spoke again, quieter, almost reverent. "He initiated this inquiry himself," the clerk nodded. "The internal corruption review. It's under his directive. They're monitoring how cases involving law enforcement misconduct are processed, including interagency cooperation." The words hung there, heavy and clinical. The kind of truth that doesn't need embellishment to destroy illusions. The prosecutor set his pen down. "So this," he gestured vaguely to the courtroom, to himself, to the walls, "was a test." The judge didn't reply. He didn't need to. The answer was in the silence that followed, a silence that now felt radioactive. The clerk placed another sheet on the bench, a single-page summary with the Bureau's letterhead, a clearance stamp at the bottom. Harlan's photograph was in the corner, the same face that had sat across from them minutes ago, expression composed, unreadable. The small rectangle of authority that could end careers. The judge stared at it. His hand trembled once, barely visible, before he withdrew it from the paper. "Dear God," he murmured. Across the room, the officers shifted again. The tallest of them, the one who'd taken the photo, reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over it, screen lighting his face in sterile blue. No photo remained. He'd deleted it, but the act felt meaningless now. The image still existed in his mind, sharper, crueler, permanent. The other officer spoke in a low voice. He didn't even look angry. No, the first answered. That's worse. The third swallowed hard. You think he'll... Stop talking, said the first too quickly. The sound of paper filled the courtroom again. The judge gathered the files with mechanical precision, stacking them, realigning corners, as if order might redeem him. The prosecutor stood and adjusted his jacket, his face drained of its courtroom polish. Your Honor, if this is part of an active bureau inquiry, we should do nothing, the judge said sharply. Until instructed. His voice cracked on the last word. The clerk placed Harlan's clearance file on the edge of the bench. The ID section, his photograph, his title, the embossed seal, caught the overhead light. The reflection shimmered faintly on the polished wood, the badge's metal glinting like something more than authority. A weapon, a mirror, a reckoning. No one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked twice, then fell silent again. Finally, the judge leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He sat here, he said quietly, in this room while we... He didn't finish the sentence. The air itself finished it for him. The prosecutor looked at the empty chair where Harlan had been. The light above it still burned brighter than the rest, washing the space in a sterile white glow. It looked less like an absence and more like a presence, as though the light itself refused to dim after what it had seen. The clerk whispered, "Should I report this to the department?" The judge hesitated. Then, "No, he will." Outside, the corridor reflected their shapes through the glass, distorted, elongated, faintly trembling. The officers were still there, but smaller now, reduced by awareness. The tallest one looked down at his own reflection, and for a moment it seemed to look back, not as a mirror but as judgment. He whispered, "We laughed at him." No one answered. The fluorescent lights flickered once. The sound of the vent deepened. The courthouse itself seemed to breathe differently, slower, heavier, aware. The clerk turned toward the door, papers still pressed to her chest. "What happens now?" The judge didn't look at her when he replied. "Now," he said, "we wait to see what truth looks like when it stops pretending to be justice." The line lingered, cold and precise. He reached for the ID badge again, fingertips brushing the embossed metal. The insignia caught the light. The eagle, the shield, the Bureau's Latin motto beneath. It felt heavier than it should have. He set it down carefully as though handling evidence. No one moved. The corridor beyond the glass was quiet. The laughter from before was gone, but its echo still lived in the walls, faint as static, impossible to erase. The badge lay in the center of the bench, its reflection cutting through the grain of polished wood like a fault line, and in that sterile, fluorescent room, the architecture of power had shifted, silently, permanently, under the weight of recognition. The sound of the courthouse returned slowly, not as noise but as hesitation. The vents hummed. The clock ticked. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, flickering as though unsure of their own steadiness. And then, through all of it, came the sound of footsteps, measured, slow, certain. Harlan had returned. The door opened without ceremony, the same door that had closed behind him minutes earlier, when the room still thought it held authority. Now, as he stepped through it again, that illusion collapsed with the quiet precision of a falling tower. No one spoke. The judge rose halfway, uncertain whether protocol required deference or defense. The prosecutor stood completely still, his file clutched like a shield. The clerk froze in place, the three officers at the back straightened instinctively, the reflex of men who have suddenly remembered what power truly looks like. Harlan crossed the room, without looking at any of them. He moved like a man accustomed to silence following him. The light caught the edge of his suit, the faint metallic glint of the bureau pin at his lapel now visible. It was the only color in the room that didn't look artificial. He stopped in the center of the space, not behind the defense table, not before the judge, but directly between them. Neutral ground made sacred by truth. He turned. His gaze moved first to the officers. "You laughed," he said. The words were quiet, but they hit like a blow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The acoustics of the room carried it perfectly, every syllable clean, deliberate. "You laughed," he repeated. "In a courthouse built to defend justice." No one answered. The officers stared at the floor. One's jaw flexed. Another swallowed audibly. He took a step closer. "Tell me, is this how you serve the people you swore to protect? Is this what the uniform means to you?" Silence. The kind of silence that isn't absence but presence. Alive, thick, impossible to escape. The judge opened his mouth, but Harlan's eyes cut to him before he could speak. The glance was enough. The judge sat back down. Harlan's tone didn't change, but the air around him did. It felt colder, cleaner. "For years," he said, "I've watched this system from the inside. I've seen how bias dresses itself in procedure, how cruelty hides behind protocol, how laughter, simple, harmless laughter, becomes the weapon that wounds most deeply." His voice was steady. Controlled fury wrapped in civility. He looked at the prosecutor now. "You stood by while the officers mocked a man under trial." A pause. "Did you think neutrality absolved you?" The prosecutor's lips parted, then closed again. There was no language left that could defend him. Harlan turned back toward the bench. The national seal loomed above it. The eagle, the arrows, the olive branch. Symbols of balance that had never quite found their equilibrium. He looked up at it, speaking not to the judge but to the room itself. "This building," he said, "was meant to be a temple of truth. But over time, truth has been replaced by decorum, justice by familiarity, law by comfort. And still you tell yourselves you serve the public." The light overhead hummed louder, flickering once, twice. He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing the badge. It caught the light like a blade, small, circular, impossibly heavy. The gold surface reflected the faces around him, pale, rigid, exposed. He placed it on the table, the sound of metal against wood sharp, decisive. "This," he said, "is not protection. It's responsibility. It doesn't make me untouchable. It makes me accountable, and it makes every one of you accountable too." The judge's throat moved as he swallowed. His hand tightened around the gavel, but he didn't raise it. Authority had become ornamental now, stripped of purpose. Harlan looked at him, not unkindly but without mercy. "You presided over this hearing," he said. "You heard the laughter through those doors. You let it pass." His tone softened, almost mournful. "Silence is complicity, Your Honor. Every time you look away, the system learns how to survive itself." He turned again, this time toward the officers. "Do you understand what your laughter meant?" One of them finally spoke, voice low, cracking. "Sir, we didn't know—" "That's the problem," Harlan said, cutting him off. "You never know. You never asked to know. Because to know would require you to see the people you mock." The officer's mouth closed. Harlan took a breath. "When you laughed, you didn't see me. You saw what you were taught to see, a threat dressed as a man, a defendant, not a citizen. That blindness is what kills people in alleys, on sidewalks, in custody." The words hit with precision. There was no shouting, no accusation, just the calm delivery of a verdict centuries in the making. He lifted the badge again. The light caught it differently this time, colder, sharper. "This badge," he said quietly, "has been used to justify everything from mercy to murder. But it means nothing without dignity. Not the kind you demand, the kind you give." He set it down once more, this time on the bench before the judge. The motion was slow, deliberate, ceremonial. The judge looked at it, at the seal, the inscription, the authority it represented, and for the first time in his career, he seemed afraid of what justice actually meant. No one moved. Harlan stood still, letting the silence breathe. It filled every corner of the room, every vent, every reflection on the glass wall outside. The officers, the clerk, the prosecutor, all of them trapped in the gravity of it. Finally, he spoke again. "You wanted to know what justice looks like," he said. "This is it." A pause. "It listens, it remembers, and it does not forget." Then he turned and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop him. As he passed through the corridor again, the light followed him, a cold, sterile halo reflected in every pane of glass. His footsteps were steady, each one an echo that felt like history turning a page. Behind him, the courtroom remained frozen, a museum of silence, filled with people who had mistaken power for righteousness. The badge on the bench gleamed faintly under the light. Its reflection split across the polished wood. Two lines of brightness cutting through the shadow. Outside, the building resumed its hum, the sound of a system pretending nothing had changed, but something had, and though no one spoke of it, everyone in that room knew they had been seen and judged and found wanting. Panic, when it arrived, did not scream. It whispered, through corridors, through closed doors, through the quiet click of secure lines being opened in haste. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment. It had become a command center of containment. Staff moved quickly, but without visible urgency, the kind of speed that exists only inside institutions trained to appear calm while burning internally. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent, washing everything in the same bureaucratic pallor. The judge's chambers were sealed first. Two men from the administrative office entered without introduction, carrying files marked Confidential Internal Review. Their suits were immaculate, their expressions neutralized. They spoke in low tones, language engineered to mean nothing even when it decided everything. The clerk was told to leave her notes on the desk. She obeyed, but her hands shook. Her files, once neatly ordered, now looked like ruins. Pages slightly misaligned, corners bent. She hesitated at the door, glancing back only once at the bench where the badge still rested. The sight of it made her inhale sharply, as though realizing too late that the air itself was evidence. Phones began to ring. Softly at first, then more. Each answered call a tether to a higher floor, a higher authority. The prosecutor sat at the counsel's table, whispering into his cell, nodding, scribbling half-legible notes. His face was pale with the sheen of procedural fear, not guilt, not conscience, but the dread of administrative consequence. In the hallway, a printer coughed out new pages, directives, amended memos, a communiqué drafted and redrafted within minutes. The first version had used the word incident. The second changed it to miscommunication. The third would remove any reference to either. Every keystroke sounded defensive. The judge remained behind the closed door of his chambers, phone to his ear, jaw tight. His voice carried through the walls in muted, clipped. Yes, confirmed. The director himself. No, we weren't informed. Of course, discretion, understood. Harlan stood outside in the corridor of glass. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He was watching the system reveal itself, the way it always did when exposed. The machine did not collapse under truth. It adapted. Always had. It wasn't built to feel shame, only to preserve its own continuity. Behind the glass, staff scurried between rooms. Muffled voices traded instructions. Doors opened and shut, each one quieter than the last. Not slammed, but sealed, as though every closure were part of a ritual. A fax machine began to hum from an office down the hall. The sound was mechanical, steady, almost soothing. Pages slid through one after another, black lines of redaction stripping meaning from reports before they ever reached their destinations. The ink was thick, censorious, final. Harlan approached one of the glass walls, his reflection folding over the images of those still inside. Clerks, officers, secretaries, each absorbed in the choreography of denial. He looked like a ghost hovering over a hive. The officers from before stood near the end of the corridor. Their postures had changed. No arrogance now, only discomfort in uniform. The tallest one, the one with the phone, kept glancing toward Harlan, waiting for a summons that would not come. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound rehearsed. Further down, two administrators passed, carrying sealed boxes labeled Evidence Hold Temporary. Their voices were low, urgent. Do we archive or destroy? One asked. Neither, the other replied. So we reclassify. That was how the machine spoke, through verbs that turned morality into process. Harlan's gaze followed them until they disappeared through another door. The sound of a lock turning echoed faintly. He stepped closer to the glass, the reflection splitting his face in half, light and shadow divided by transparency. He studied the line between them, wondering which side the system believed itself to be on. A security officer approached hesitantly. Sir, do you need an escort to your vehicle? Harlan turned his head slightly. The man looked young, eyes wide with bureaucratic innocence, someone who still believed institutions were self-correcting. No, Harlan said quietly. I'll walk. The officer nodded, relieved, and retreated down the corridor, his reflection shrinking beside Harlan's. Inside the courtroom, the judge finally emerged. He looked older, drained of certainty. His robe hung unevenly at the shoulders. He approached Harlan with slow, deliberate steps, each one a negotiation between duty and fear. "Director Harlan," he said, voice low, "I trust there will be context provided before this becomes public." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. "Public?" The judge hesitated. "Yes, I mean, the Bureau, this event, it could unsettle public confidence." Harlan's expression didn't change. "Perhaps it should." The judge opened his mouth, then closed it. Words failed him, as they often did when faced with moral clarity. Behind them, the fax machine clicked again. Another transmission completed. Another layer of truth erased before daylight could reach it. The judge exhaled. "You must understand, Director, the institution—" Harlan cut him off. "The institution will survive. It always does. The question is what it becomes in the process." He adjusted his cufflinks, the smallest, most deliberate act of composure, and looked past the judge through the corridor, into the machinery of quiet panic that surrounded them. Secretaries typing, phones ringing, officers whispering, every movement, every sound, a testament to self-preservation disguised as professionalism. "Sir," the judge said softly, "what will you do now?" Harlan turned fully toward him, eyes calm, almost gentle. "What I came here to do." He walked past him, back into the corridor of glass. The lights overhead reflected his image a dozen times over, each one sharper, colder. The sound of his footsteps fell into rhythm with the hum of the building, a slow, deliberate cadence against the frantic pulse of the machine. As he passed the offices, he could see the redacted documents piling in trays, the black ink spreading like infection. He could hear the fax machine starting another cycle, another attempt at cleansing. But truth wasn't paper. It was memory. And memory, once awakened, doesn't redact. At the far end of the corridor, a door opened automatically. Cool air poured in from outside, carrying the faint scent of rain. He paused, glancing back one last time. Through the glass, the courthouse glowed under fluorescent order, every desk occupied, every protocol engaged, the illusion of control perfectly restored. Except for one thing. The badge was gone. He had taken it. The table where it had rested now reflected only the sterile light above. Empty but for the faint outline it had left behind. A circular impression, dull against the polish. Proof that something powerful had once rested there. The machine would continue as it always did, humming, processing, tracing. But something irreversible had entered its circuits, and as Harlan stepped into the rain, the automatic doors closing quietly behind him, the building seemed to exhale. A structure relieved to return to silence, unaware that silence itself had just been condemned. The conference room was colder than the courtroom. Not in temperature. The air was carefully regulated, precise, but in spirit. The walls were matte grey, soundproofed, unadorned. Even the flag in the corner looked subdued, its colors dulled by fluorescent restraint. At the far end of the long table sat the Federal Oversight Board, 5 members. 5 faces trained in composure. They didn't look at Harlan so much as they measured him, the way bureaucrats measure anything that might disrupt equilibrium. He sat opposite them, posture straight, expression unreadable. The same man who had once been mocked now carried the silence of judgment itself. A single glass of water stood before him, untouched. The surface was still, catching light from the ceiling in a pale ellipse. Between them, a stenographer sat poised, her fingers hovering over the keys, an obedient witness of record. Every sound in that room except the truth would be captured. The chairman cleared his throat. "Director Harlan," he began, voice balanced between respect and apprehension, "thank you for appearing voluntarily." Harlan nodded once. "Voluntarily," he echoed, the word flat, unembellished. The chairman continued, "We understand there was an incident at the district courthouse." He consulted his papers as if they might protect him. "Before we proceed to formal statements, would you like to clarify your account?" Harlan's gaze didn't shift. No clarification needed. It happened exactly as it appeared. The stenographer's keys clicked once, a clean, mechanical sound that filled the silence like raindrops on glass. One of the board members leaned forward. "Director, we must establish procedural context. For the record, were you acting in an official capacity?" "I was observing a case related to internal corruption," Harlan said. His tone was calm but edged with iron. I intended to see how our justice system operates when it thinks no one is watching. Another pause. Another volley of keystrokes, and what did you find? Harlan looked at them. Each face carefully blank, lips tightened, eyes professionally curious. I found it operating as designed. The room didn't react. But the air changed. He continued, voice even, unhurried. The officers didn't laugh because they were evil men. They laughed because the system taught them they could. The prosecutor didn't intervene because the system rewards silence. And the judge didn't stop them because authority prefers decorum to disruption. He paused. The clock on the wall ticked once. Loud, deliberate, indifferent. The system isn't broken, he said softly. It's perfected. The chairman shifted in his chair. Director, with respect, your characterization may be accurate, Harlan interrupted. The word cut cleanly through the air. Heavier than any accusation. One of the female board members exhaled sharply, pen trembling slightly as she wrote. Director, she said, we understand your personal experience was regrettable, but it wasn't personal, Harlan said. His tone was steady, deliberate. It was instructive. He leaned forward now, just enough to close the moral distance between them. What happened to me happens every day, to men and women without titles, without recourse, without witnesses. The only difference is that this time, the system humiliated someone who could make it write a report about itself. The stenographer's typing faltered for the first time. The chairman cleared his throat again, as if to reclaim control. Director, these are serious allegations. They're not allegations, Harlan said. They're observations. He gestured lightly toward the stenographer. You'll find them in your own record soon enough. The chairman blinked, recalibrating. And what do you propose we do? Harlan's reply was instant. Stop pretending reform is an act of mercy. It's an act of survival. The words settled into the room like weight. No one moved. He looked down briefly at the untouched glass of water. Condensation had gathered at its base, a perfect ring of moisture bleeding slowly into the polished wood. The mark would remain long after the glass was removed. I've read every policy revision you've issued in the last decade, he said. Each one written to protect institutions, not people. You tighten language, add oversight, create new committees. You think procedure equals progress. He looked up again, eyes steady. But injustice doesn't care about memos. The woman on the left leaned back, crossing her arms. Director, you're suggesting institutional intent. I'm stating institutional design, he corrected. Silence, the kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. The stenographer kept typing, her fingers moving faster now, as though racing to keep up with something larger than bureaucracy. One of the older members finally spoke. You're asking us to indict our own foundation. No, Harlan said. I'm asking you to acknowledge it. Indictment comes later. The clock ticked again. Each second stretched wider. He continued more softly now. You can't fix what you refuse to name. The men in that courthouse didn't act alone. They're the surface of a structure that trains them to see humanity as hierarchy. He leaned back, folding his hands. You don't correct that with training modules. You correct it with courage. No one responded. The word courage didn't belong in rooms like this. Finally, the chairman tried again. Director, we must consider the political ramifications of your statement. Politics is what you call morality when you've run out of excuses. The stenographer stopped typing. Looked up, then resumed. The board members exchanged glances. The institutional reflex. Discomfort polished into restraint. Harlan rose slowly, his chair sliding back with a sound that made them all flinch. He adjusted his jacket. You called this a hearing, he said. But hearings only matter when someone listens. He looked at the stenographer again. You've been listening. Keep the record clean. The chairman straightened his papers. Director Harlan, this session is not yet concluded. It is, Harlan said. He glanced once more at the untouched glass of water. The system's thirst isn't for justice. It's for preservation. And it's already drinking itself dry. He walked toward the door. Each step deliberate, echoing off tile and time. Behind him no one spoke. Only the clock continued ticking, steady, mechanical, counting down the seconds until the next official version of truth would be drafted. The stenographer's last line caught it perfectly. Session adjourned by Director Harlan, voluntarily, and beneath it the faint circular watermark of a glass that was never touched. The interrogation room was smaller than it appeared in photographs. No mirrors, no cameras visible. Just a table, 2 chairs, and the hum of air conditioning too cold for comfort. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, washing everything in a sterile blue. At the center sat Director Harlan. He had brought nothing with him except a pen, a black metal instrument that rested motionless beside a single sheet of paper. The first officer entered under escort. His badge had been taken at the door. Without it, he looked younger, uncertain of posture. He sat down too quickly, then adjusted as if seeking the right balance between obedience and pride. "Officer Dempsey," Harlan said. His tone was neutral. Not cold, measured. Dempsey nodded, clearing his throat. "Yes, sir." Silence stretched. The hum of the vents filled it, steady, impersonal. Harlan didn't look at him right away. He studied the motionless pen, the small reflection of light along its edge. The officer shifted. Finally, Harlan spoke. "Tell me what happened." Dempsey blinked, relieved to be given direction. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were." "That's true," Harlan said. "And if you had known?" The officer hesitated. Then none of that would have happened." "Exactly," Harlan said. "That's the problem." The air between them thickened. Dempsey's eyes darted to the pen, then back. "Sir, I didn't mean any harm. It was just talk. Joking, you know. Among colleagues." "Joking," Harlan repeated, the word sharp in its restraint. "What was the joke?" Dempsey's mouth opened, then closed. His hand moved toward his collar, tugging slightly. Sweat glistened just beneath his jawline, shining faintly under the harsh light. "I don't remember the exact—" "You do," Harlan interrupted, still calm. "But say you didn't. What would it change?" Dempsey swallowed. The silence returned, heavy and exact. Harlan leaned back, eyes steady. "You thought you were safe, because you believed your target couldn't respond. That's not a joke. That's power, disguised as humor." The officer looked down at his hands, clasped, knuckles tight. "Sir, I'm not a bad man." "No," Harlan said softly. "You're a comfortable one." That struck harder than accusation. Harlan reached for his pen, clicked it once, a small sound that made Dempsey flinch. "You can go," Harlan said. "Next." The guard opened the door. Dempsey stood too fast, muttered something that might have been "thank you," and left. The door shut. The sound echoed like punctuation. The next man entered. Officer Ruiz. Broader shoulders, defensive stance. He sat without invitation, leaning forward as if to reclaim space. "You think you're better than us," he said before Harlan could speak. "You think because you wear a suit and a title, you're not like us." Harlan regarded him quietly. "And what are you like, Officer Ruiz?" "Real?" Ruiz said. "We see people how they are. Out there on the street. We deal with what no one else wants to." Harlan nodded slightly. "And the laughter?" Ruiz hesitated, jaw tightening. "Cop's joke. That's how we cope. If you'd ever—" "I have," Harlan said. His tone didn't rise, but the weight of it landed. "I've stood where you stood. I've watched blood dry on asphalt. I've written reports no one reads. I know coping. I also know cruelty dressed as ritual." Ruiz's face flushed. His hand twitched toward the table, then withdrew. Harlan's pen remained still. "You mock what you fear," he said. "And you fear what you refuse to understand." Ruiz opened his mouth, stopped. His lips trembled, but no words formed. For the first time, something human flickered beneath his defiance. "Not guilt, recognition. Brief, painful. You can go," Harlan said. Ruiz rose slower than he'd sat. When he left, the air seemed to shift again, lighter for a moment, though the room remained cold. The final man entered without meeting Harlan's gaze. Officer Kelman. He was older than the others, gray at the temples, uniform slightly frayed. He closed the door himself quietly, almost respectfully. He didn't sit right away. "Sir, I've been in this job 22 years. Harlan nodded once. "Sit," Kelman obeyed. "You've seen the reports, I'm sure." "About morale." "About what we face. Sometimes it's easier to dehumanize," Harlan finished for him. Kelman's shoulders sagged. "Yes, easier." They sat in silence. The clock ticked once on the wall, loud in its precision. Harlan studied him. "When you saw me that day, what did you see?" Kelman's eyes flicked upward, then down again. "I saw another defendant. Not a man," Harlan said. Kelman's throat worked. "No, sir." Harlan nodded. "You're honest." "That's rare." Kelman looked up, searching for something in Harlan's face, anger, maybe pity. He found neither. Only clarity. Harlan leaned forward. Do you know why I didn't stop you? Kelman shook his head. Because I wanted to see how long the mask would hold, Harlan said. I wanted to measure the distance between your laughter and your conscience. Kelman's hands twisted together. And, Harlan looked at the pen again. The reflection of the overhead light ran down its length like a blade. I'm still measuring. Kelman exhaled shakily. What happens now? The system decides, Harlan said. It always does. He rose, signaling the end. But for once it will do so with open eyes. Kelman stood too. Sir, he hesitated, the word trembling in his mouth. I'm sorry. Harlan looked at him, truly looked, and for a brief second something softened. You're not sorry yet, he said. You're afraid. Sorry comes later when fear has nowhere left to go. Kelman lowered his head. Yes, sir. Harlan sat again, returning to stillness. The door closed. The room emptied itself of motion. Only the hum of air and the ticking clock remained. He placed his hands flat on the table, symmetrical, controlled, and stared at the pen. He had not written a single word, because what mattered here could not be recorded in ink. It was written in posture, in tremors, in the quiet sweat that betrayed every man who thought silence was safety. He picked up the pen, weighed it in his hand, then set it down again precisely in line with the edge of the paper. The clock ticked once more, breaking the symmetry. 3 confessions had been made, none complete, and outside that small frozen room, the machinery of justice kept moving, polishing its image, filing its reports, pretending that repentance could be managed by form. But inside, in that silence, Harlan knew the truth. The system didn't need liars to survive. It only needed believers. The office was quiet except for the steady hum of the typewriter. It was an old machine, heavy, matte black, built in an era when permanence still mattered. Each keystroke landed with the sound of conviction. Director Harlan sat alone. The blinds were half closed, slicing the afternoon light into long, thin bands across his desk. Dust floated in them, visible only because the sun insisted on truth. Outside, the federal building moved as always. Muted corridors, restrained voices, the choreography of efficiency. But in this room, time had slowed to the rhythm of the typewriter. He had been at it for hours, though he hadn't noticed. His fingers moved without hesitation. Each word was deliberate, carved, weighted. He wasn't recording events. He was carving testimony. The report began with no preamble, no apology. Subject: Internal Review of Conduct. Case Observation. Author: Director Harlan J. Cole. Purpose: to document not the actions of individuals, but the condition of the institution that formed them. He paused, letting the words settle. The machine's hum filled the silence like low thunder waiting for rain. He began again. Justice, as currently practiced, has become a ritual of appearance. The forms are correct, the tone measured, the posture exact, but beneath the marble surface lies rot too disciplined to smell. The sentence felt heavy even on paper. He reached for the glass of water beside him, half empty now, untouched for hours, and set it aside. The rim left a faint ring on the desk, echoing the one in the oversight chamber days earlier. He continued typing. The men in that courtroom did not invent prejudice. They inherited it, not through words, but through silence, through reward, through habit. A system does not teach cruelty. It permits it until it becomes invisible. Another pause. The keys cooled under his fingers. The clock on the wall ticked once, then twice. Shadows stretched across the desk as the sun began its slow descent. He leaned back, eyes tracing the seal embossed on the blank cover page beside him, the federal insignia, the eagle mid-flight, talons outstretched, power pretending to guard virtue. He wondered how many reports had been sealed under that same emblem, unread, unresolved, stored for posterity rather than change. The typewriter waited. He began again. The judiciary operates as theatre, the prosecution as ceremony. Each actor believes he performs justice because the stage is polished, the costumes clean. Yet when the script demands silence, even the innocent learn to speak in whispers. The words came slower now. The sound of typing echoed faintly against the walls, absorbed by old paint, old air. He thought of Dempsey's nervous hands, Ruiz's defiance, Kelman's trembling honesty, each one different, yet molded from the same institutional clay. Men shaped not by hatred but by repetition. Accountability has become a procedural myth, a term cited, never practiced. The system's greatest strength is its ability to appear self-correcting while ensuring nothing ever changes. The carriage slid back, the bell dinged softly. He kept going. In the eyes of the bureau, of the courts, of every sworn office under this flag, dignity is treated as optional. Justice, discretionary. And humanity, negotiable. He stopped, stared at that last word, negotiable. It looked obscene on the page. He rose from his chair, crossing to the window. The city stretched beneath him, symmetrical streets, polished facades, people reduced to motion. From here everything looked orderly. From here injustice was invisible. He rested a hand on the glass. It was cool to the touch. Transparent but impenetrable. Behind him the typewriter sat waiting, a machine of truth too honest for modern use. He returned to the desk, sat, typed again. I am the director of an institution built to expose corruption. Yet today, I see clearly that we are its most skillful architects. He exhaled through his nose. Not anger, not fatigue. Resignation edged with purpose. The daylight had begun to fade. The thin bars of light across the desk were dissolving into grey. He switched on the small lamp beside him, a soft glow, intimate, human. I submit this report not to seek punishment, but recognition. We cannot discipline a culture without first confessing it. Every officer's laughter, every prosecutor's glance, every judge's silence, all are threads in the same fabric. He pulled another page into the roller, continuing without pause. This is not a call for reform. Reform has been our word for denial. This is a record, not a mirror. Whoever reads it must decide whether reflection is enough. He stopped typing. The lamp buzzed faintly. He looked at the stack of completed pages, precise, square, each one holding more truth than any press conference could bear. He signed the final line. Harlan J. Cole, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then he pressed the seal. The metal stamp sank into paper with a dry, deliberate sound, authority marking confession. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Outside, the sun disappeared beyond the skyline. The last light of day touched the edge of the report, gilding it in fleeting gold before fading into shadow. Harlan sat back, hands folded. The typewriter was silent now, its purpose fulfilled. He could already imagine what would happen next. The report filed, reviewed, buried, cited once in a committee hearing, then archived under internal review, but it would exist. And that was enough. He turned off the lamp. In the dimness, the seal caught the faintest reflection from the window, a circle of authority now containing something it had never held before. Truth. The hum of the building continued beyond his door. Phones. Printers, the ceaseless rhythm of preservation. Inside, only the faint echo of the typewriter remained, imprinted in the air like memory. He gathered the pages, placed them in the folder, and laid it in the center of his desk. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to close his eyes. The machine had spoken. Now the silence would have to answer. It began with a headline that shouldn't have existed. FBI Director witnesses, racial mockery in courtroom, files internal report. The words appeared first on a fringe investigative blog, time-stamped 3:47 a.m. Within hours, they bled into mainstream circulation. By morning, the story had consumed the nation's oxygen. Every network claimed the exclusive. Every host rehearsed indignation. Across the city, television screens flickered like restless eyes. Hotel lobbies, train stations, diner counters, all illuminated by looping footage of marble corridors and blurred stills from the courthouse. The caption font was always the same shade of red, the tone the same, moral panic, packaged for broadcast. In the Bureau's headquarters, monitors lined the wall of the communications wing. Rows of staffers sat under the soft hum of fluorescent light, their faces lit by shifting blues and whites. Every screen showed the same thing, the report's text scrolling in fragments, talking heads dissecting its tone, politicians preening before microphones. A disturbing breach of professionalism. A political stunt disguised as moral clarity raises serious questions about leadership. The words layered atop one another, indistinguishable in their self-importance. Director Harlan Cole did not watch. He sat in his office, blinds drawn. The air was still. The phone on his desk vibrated again and again. Calls from Washington, from networks, from allies pretending concern. He didn't answer. Each vibration was another pulse of the institution, reminding him of its heartbeat. Steady, mechanical, unfeeling. He had known this would happen. Truth never entered the world quietly. It was always dragged out, interrogated and repackaged, until it no longer resembled itself. Outside, the city buzzed. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones extended toward anyone with a badge or an opinion. Cars slowed as passers-by pointed at the swarm of cameras. Truth, spectacle, commerce, indistinguishable now. By noon, the story had metastasized into a dozen narratives. The bravery of the director, the bias of the media, the corruption of the courts, the overreach of federal authority. Each headline diluted the core. Each statement blurred the line between revelation and performance. Inside one newsroom, the anchor leaned forward, her voice low. Urgent. If this report is authentic, it raises profound questions about systemic bias within the Department of Justice. But why release it now? Her co-host smirked. Timing is everything in Washington. They both smiled, as if justice were a strategy meeting. In another studio, a former prosecutor spoke with theatrical outrage, his cufflinks catching the light. Let's not forget, this director is no saint. Perhaps this was an internal power play gone public. Don't mistake moral theater for courage. And in between segments, advertisements for luxury sedans and insurance played without irony. The world had learned to digest outrage in commercial breaks. Back in the bureau, staff moved like ghosts. No one met his eyes. No one asked questions. They knew silence was the safest allegiance. The director's name had become currency, spoken cautiously, traded in whispers. From his office window, Harlan could see the reporters gathering at the main entrance. Their lenses glinted in the afternoon light like tiny weapons. A line of uniformed officers stood at the door, not to protect him, but to manage optics. He turned away. On his desk lay a copy of the morning paper, folded to the front page. His own name printed in bold above the subheadline, Director's Report Leaked Amid Questions of Bureau Integrity. The word leaked, such a clean euphemism for theft. He reached for his pen, but didn't write. The act felt meaningless now. Words belonged to the air, and the air belonged to the machine. He thought of the courtroom's cold marble, the laughter echoing through metal vents. The memory returned not as pain, but as instruction. He had witnessed what power looked like when it believed itself unseen. Now the nation was witnessing what truth looked like when it refused to stay buried. By evening, satellite vans had lined the street outside bureau headquarters. Drones circled. News anchors broadcast from the sidewalk, voices measured, expressions grave. The building itself had become a symbol, authority under siege. Inside, Harlan stood at the window again. The city lights shimmered in the glass, gold, white, red. A reflection of a world always watching, rarely understanding. He thought of turning on the television. He didn't. He preferred the silence, the real kind, not the orchestrated pauses of televised concern. In the silence, he could almost hear the whir of the typewriter from days before, the sound of honesty before translation. Behind him, the intercom buzzed softly. His assistant's voice, tentative. Sir, the Attorney General is asking for a statement. The networks are requesting a live address. Should I? No. A pause. They're saying it might help clarify intent. He turned, his voice steady. Truth doesn't need intent. The intercom clicked off. He stood alone again. The light in his office had shifted, dimmer now, colder. On his desk, the sealed report rested where it had always been, untouched since the night he wrote it. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the system, and the system would decide what survived. Outside, the city pulsed with noise. Headlines scrolled across every screen. Director under fire. Justice in question. Nation divided. Each phrase polished until it gleamed with neutrality, safe enough to broadcast, empty enough to sell. He watched as the lights of news trucks reflected against the bureau's facade, brief flashes of color sliding across gray stone, red, blue, white. The flag in motion. Without meaning, he lowered the blinds. The room fell into shadow. The hum of the fluorescent light persisted, faint and unwavering. In the darkness, he realized the final truth. Institutions don't fear exposure. They fear comprehension. They can endure scandal, They cannot endure clarity. He sat again, hands folded, the sound of distant sirens bleeding through the glass. The city was alive with noise, but somewhere beneath it all, he sensed the old rhythm of justice, slow, deliberate, still waiting to be reborn. He reached for the report, ran his fingers over the embossed seal and whispered, not in hope, but in defiance, let them rewrite it. The truth doesn't vanish. It waits. The words dissolved into the air, caught in the soft electric hum of the building. Outside, television screens continued to flicker across the city, 1,000 variations of one story, each bending toward comfort. And yet somewhere beneath the noise, something had shifted, unseen but irreversible. The truth was no longer contained. The city outside his window was a scatter of quiet lights, each one pulsing faintly against the night. From this height it looked peaceful, almost merciful. Streets shimmered like veins beneath the glass. The skyline cut a clean horizon, cold and exact. Inside, his apartment was still, too still. Director Harlan J stood by the window, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. The same posture he had in the bureau, only here there were no observers, no optics. The floorboards creaked when he moved, a sound so human it startled him. On the table behind him sat an unopened bottle of wine and a single empty glass. The cork was still sealed, the dust on the bottle's neck disturbed only once, weeks ago, when he'd thought he might celebrate something, though he couldn't remember what. It had remained there untouched, a monument to deferred solace. The city hummed beneath him. Traffic lights cycled in patient rhythm. He could hear a siren somewhere far off, thin, almost apologetic. He turned back toward the window, his reflection meeting him halfway in the glass. The image looked unfamiliar tonight, older perhaps, or simply exposed. The fluorescent wash of the city bent across his face in bars of pale blue and sodium yellow, fractured by the glass. It made him look like two people at once, the director and the man who had chosen silence in a courtroom filled with laughter. The laughter. It had been days, yet it replayed without sound now, only motion. The tilt of a shoulder, the tightening of a smirk. The rhythm of hands on a utility belt. Every gesture had its meaning, every pause its weight. He no longer heard it as insult. He heard it as proof, evidence not of their hatred but of the system's ease, the way prejudice had learned to dress itself in humor so it could pass through metal detectors unsearched. He moved to the table and picked up the report, his copy, the one unsealed, margins marked with faint fingerprints. He flipped to the final page and read his signature. The ink had faded slightly under the desk lamp. Harlan J. Cole, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. It looked final, like a gravestone inscription. He closed it again. For years he had believed reform was a matter of exposure. That truth, once seen, could not be ignored. He had staked a career on that faith. But the past week had proven otherwise. Exposure did not wound the system. It strengthened it. The machine had absorbed the outrage, metabolized it, and returned to equilibrium. The headlines had already softened. The networks were moving on. Tomorrow there would be another story, another outrage, another neatly packaged fall from grace. He reached for the wine but didn't open it. The gesture was enough. It reminded him of control, the choice to refrain, the discipline that had carried him through every room, every hearing, every provocation. He had never given them what they wanted, reaction. Even now he would not. He sat, resting his elbows on the table, hands steepled before him. The city's glow framed him in outline. The air conditioner clicked off. Silence returned, dense, complete. He thought of his father then, a quiet man from Baltimore who'd worn the same gray suit to church every Sunday, who'd told him once, "Dignity isn't how you stand when you're praised. It's how you stand when you're mocked." He had lived that lesson in marble halls. He had worn it like armor, but now dignity felt heavier than armor. It felt like restraint, like exhaustion disguised as grace. He looked again at his reflection in the window. Behind his own image, the city pulsed, indifferent, mechanical. He wondered how many others out there were keeping their silence tonight. How many understood that endurance was not consent, but survival? On the counter, his phone buzzed again. Missed calls and Attorney General 3. Deputy Director 5. Media Relations 11. He didn't answer. He didn't even reach for it. The phone's light faded, leaving only the room's dim warmth. He stood again, walking toward the bookshelf on the far wall. The spines gleamed softly. Reports, transcripts, legal texts, history volumes. The architecture of authority. He pulled one at random. The Origins of Power, its cover worn at the edges, and flipped it open. Inside, a line he'd underlined years ago. Power's greatest illusion is that it seeks preservation. In truth, it fears recognition. He read it twice, then closed the book. At the far corner of the room near the door hung his old field coat, dark wool, collar stiff, pockets deep. The coat he'd worn during field work years ago, before the bureau turned him into a nameplate and a protocol. He walked over and ran his hand across the sleeve. The texture was coarse, grounding. He remembered what it felt like to be in motion, to witness injustice not from behind glass but in the streets. Real air, real breath, real consequence. Maybe that was what reform demanded. Not declarations but proximity. Not exposure through screens but confrontation in person. He returned to the table. The bottle of wine still waited inert. The report lay beside it. The two objects mirrored each other perfectly. One unopened, one unread. Outside, the skyline flickered, a constant reminder of motion without progress. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, watching his breath cloud faintly against the glass. Then he spoke softly, more to the reflection than to himself. Truth doesn't change systems. People do, but people must first be willing to see. His own voice startled him. It had been days since he'd spoken aloud in this apartment. The sound felt raw, human. He set the report aside and looked again at the unopened bottle. After a long moment he smiled, just barely. The kind of smile that knew the difference between hope and endurance. He turned away from the table, flicked off the lamp, and crossed to the window once more. The city lay before him, indifferent, immense, waiting. For a while he simply stood there, motionless, his reflection blending with the skyline. Director and man, witness and subject, truth and silence. Somewhere beyond the glass a siren rose and fell, the same soft arc he'd heard earlier. A reminder that order continued, however flawed. He whispered one final line into the dark. Let them rebuild their illusion. I'll keep the record. And then he stood there, quiet as the city itself, watching the lights blink one by one across the horizon, signals of life, of continuity, of something still worth saving. The bottle remained unopened, the night unbroken. The reflection in the window lingered long after he turned away, two figures in one pane, divided by glass but bound by purpose. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, the reckoning had only begun. The auditorium was smaller than it looked on television. The lights made it feel infinite, bright, surgical, merciless. Rows of cameras formed a half-moon around the podium, their lenses staring like mechanical eyes, each one hungering for narrative. Director Harlan J stood at the center. No notes, no teleprompter, no visible hesitation, only the podium, the light, and the silence. The seal of the United States gleamed on the wood before him, that familiar emblem of vigilance and hypocrisy, its eagle still pretending to guard what men had long abandoned. Behind him hung the flag, motionless in the air-conditioned stillness. He adjusted the microphone once. The feedback hissed and died. Across the country, millions watched. Living rooms, bars, offices, police precincts, classrooms. The networks had framed it as the director's response. Every channel carried it live. Some expected an apology, others a defense. But the man at the podium looked neither defensive nor contrite. He looked inevitable, he began. For weeks, this nation has spoken about one moment, a courtroom, a handful of words, a few men's laughter. But that moment was not an anomaly. It was a mirror. The first sentence landed heavy in the room. He let the silence stretch long enough for the words to root, uncomfortable enough for the cameras to shift. When a system mocks the people it was built to protect, it reveals what it has always been. A hierarchy, not a service. Power pretending to be justice. A flicker of movement among the front row, aides, officials, a senator or two uneasy. Those officers did not invent the rot. They inherited it. And every institution that laughed with them, by silence, by indifference, helped write the script they followed. He looked directly into the camera now. His gaze was steady, almost surgical. I have heard from many who wish I had stayed silent, who say the Bureau must remain above controversy. To them I say this: Silence is controversy spoken in the language of fear. Another pause. No sound except the soft hum of the lights overhead. He continued, his tone unwavering, the cadence of a man not performing but testifying. Accountability is not revenge. It is maintenance. Without it, institutions decay into performance. We cannot prosecute dignity into existence. We must practice it. The phrase echoed through the hall, clean and final. You cannot fix a system by punishing symptoms. You must confront the design. He drew a breath, eyes dropping briefly to the podium, not to gather himself, but to let the gravity of the next words arrive at their own pace. We built our justice system to appear blind, but blindness has never been our flaw. Our flaw is where we choose to look. There was no movement among the audience now, only stillness taut as wire. For decades we have measured fairness by procedure, not by truth. We have mistaken order for justice, silence for respect, punishment for morality. And in doing so we have built a nation where the scales of justice hang not evenly but decoratively. He let that sentence breathe. Cameras clicked once, then fell quiet. Some have asked what I want. I want nothing. I am not seeking vindication. I am seeking acknowledgement. Because acknowledgement is where reform begins, and where denial ends. He lifted his chin slightly. The podium light cast a thin gold line along his jaw. The courtroom I sat in weeks ago was not extraordinary. It was ordinary. That is the problem. We have normalized the conditions of humiliation so deeply that even our laughter has become institutional. He leaned slightly forward. The microphones caught every breath. I do not speak tonight to condemn men. I speak to confront machinery. The quiet engines that turn prejudice into protocol and cruelty into procedure. Machines are efficient, but they are never moral. In the back row, someone coughed. It sounded distant, almost irrelevant. I have been told that this address will make enemies. I accept that. I have lived long enough to know that comfort is the currency of complicity. He rested a hand on the edge of the podium. His wedding ring caught the light, a small circle of reflection amid the glare. I have seen good men lose their moral compass in the name of order. I have seen systems praise loyalty while devouring conscience. I have watched as institutions congratulate themselves for investigating injustice they themselves created. He let out a quiet breath, controlled, steady. Tonight I ask for no applause, no alliance. I ask only for attention, real attention, the kind that forces a nation to see itself without costume. He paused again, and for a brief moment, he seemed to step outside himself, as if viewing the scene from above. The lights, the cameras, the flag, the seal, the artificial stillness. He continued, softer now but sharper for it. The question is not whether our institutions are corrupt. The question is whether we are willing to admit that corruption has become tradition. The line hit like a blade. Quiet, efficient, undeniable. If justice is to mean anything, it must first learn to listen. And when it listens, it must not flinch. The silence afterward was immense, not absence, but reverence. He looked again into the lens, into millions of unseen eyes. We do not need better laws. We need better courage. He let the words hang. Then, and if this address costs me my position, my reputation, or my comfort, then let that be the price of finally saying aloud what every courtroom already knows. He stepped back slightly, the podium light glinting off the seal once more. Justice is not blind. It's waiting to see who dares to open their eyes. He said nothing more, no closing phrase. No, thank you. Just silence. The cameras held on him longer than usual, long enough for the stillness to feel dangerous. His eyes remained steady, his posture unbroken. The air itself seemed to contract. Then the feed cut. The screen went black. In homes across the country, viewers sat motionless, unsure whether what they'd witnessed was a confession, a warning, or a benediction. In the auditorium, no one clapped. No one dared to move. The lights hummed overhead, and at the center of it all, one man, standing before the emblem of a nation, his face half lit, half shadow. The silence around him louder than any applause could ever be. The podium light flickered once, then the room exhaled. The courthouse had returned to order. The floors were polished again, the glass walls spotless, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air. The same hum of fluorescent lights filled the corridors, constant, unwavering, bureaucratic. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that pretends to be moral. No trace remained of the laughter, the scandal, the speech that had set the nation on edge. At least, not visibly. A new group of officers now stood at the security checkpoint. Their uniforms were crisp, their smiles rehearsed. They spoke softly, politely, their professionalism precise, almost penitential. Each movement was careful, each gesture calibrated. The building had learned, not to change, but to perform change. At 8 a.m., as every morning, the courthouse opened its doors. People entered, files in hand, voices low, eyes forward. Lawyers brushed past defendants, clerks passed documents between glass windows, and the old rhythm resumed, the choreography of civility. From above, through the glass walls, the entire place looked serene, efficient, self-contained. The system was breathing again. But the air was different now, heavier, as if carrying memory. In courtroom 4B, preparations were underway for another hearing, a procedural review concerning the Bureau's internal conduct, an echo of an echo. The cameras were gone this time. The press had moved on, but the seats were filled with officials, aides, and a handful of reporters still loyal to curiosity. At the front of the room, a single chair sat empty behind the nameplate, Director Harlan J. The hearing was scheduled to begin at 9. It was already past 10. The chairwoman cleared her throat, adjusted her papers, and said into the microphone, "We have been informed that Director Cole will not be in attendance." The words fell flat. Like a stamp on a forgotten file, no one reacted. A clerk leaned forward, whispering something to another. The stenographer typed without pause. On the record, it would read as procedural. On the ground, it felt like absence with purpose. The chairwoman continued, "In his stead, we will proceed with review of the policies his office implemented following the incident." The incident. That was what it had become, a single noun, sanitized, filed, and ready for citation. Behind her, a staffer placed a folder on the table. On its cover, the Bureau seal, gold against dark blue. Inside, the new compliance protocols, workshops, trainings, oversight boards. Measures designed not to heal but to reassure. A system performing accountability, its own form of theater. As the panel discussed procedures, a faint vibration echoed through the room, the hum of the building's ventilation, steady, mechanical. The same sound that had filled the corridor months ago when a man had sat waiting to be humiliated. The same sound that had accompanied laughter. Nothing in the building had changed, except the actors. At the back of the courtroom, an officer stood near the door, young, fresh-faced, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He adjusted his badge, the metal catching the fluorescent light just as it once had on another's chest. He looked forward, unaware of the history under his feet. Outside, the hallway reflected everything, the moving bodies, the flicker of fluorescent light, the infinite self-replication of bureaucracy. Glass walls, transparent yet opaque in meaning, transparency without understanding. At 10:45, the chairwoman called for a brief recess. Papers shuffled. Voices rose in polite chatter. Someone laughed. Quietly, nervously, the kind of laugh meant to fill silence, not offend. Still, it carried. It always did. Across the room, the empty chair remained unmoved, untouched. Its leather back caught the light in a thin sheen. On the table before it lay an ID badge, gold lettering, worn edges. The faint outline of a name almost rubbed smooth, Cole. HJ, no one knew who had placed it there. When the session resumed, the chairwoman cleared her throat again. Let the record reflect that the director's absence has been duly noted. His statement from the address remains part of the federal record. A pause. Then routine resumed. The stenographer typed. The air conditioner hummed. The fluorescent lights burned steady overhead, their glow indifferent to content, loyal only to continuity. Through the glass walls, the corridor looked almost identical to the morning of that first hearing. Polished marble, faint reflections, muted steps. The same architecture of order, but the silence had changed. It was no longer innocent. Somewhere deep in the building's memory, in the recorded transcripts, the archived footage, the whispered recollections of staff, his voice remained. Not loud, not angry, but unerasable. Justice is not blind. It's waiting to see who dares to open their eyes. The words had become citation, then quotation, then cliché. Yet even diluted, they persisted. In the months that followed his address, Cole had resigned quietly. No press conference, no farewell. His office had been emptied in one night. His personal effects returned in a single sealed box. He had refused interviews, invitations, distinctions. The system had survived. Of course it had, but survival was not victory. Outside, as the hearing dragged on, the city moved in rhythm, cars in lines, pedestrians crossing, sirens at intervals. The courthouse gleamed in the morning light, every window reflecting a version of the sky. From a distance, it looked immaculate, unshaken, yet inside, under the hum of machinery and protocol, a small, persistent discomfort remained, the residue of recognition, because somewhere in that building, whether in the cracks of the marble or the faint etchings on the badge left behind, something had been recorded that could not be redacted, a moment when the system had been forced to see itself. At 11:30 the session adjourned. Papers gathered, chairs scraped, voices murmured. The room emptied in polite sequence until only the empty chair remained. The clerk approached, unsure what to do with it. For a moment he hesitated, hand hovering over the badge on the table. Then, with bureaucratic precision, he placed it in a small envelope marked "to be filed." The door closed softly behind him. The hum of the fluorescent lights continued, unwavering, and for a brief moment, when no one was there to watch, the badge reflected the ceiling's white glow, a faint shimmer of gold. Like breath on glass outside, the world went on. Cases were tried. Decisions were rendered. Laughter returned to corridors, but within the courthouse, behind every pane of glass, under every echoing step, the memory remained. Invisible but alive, a system watching itself unchanged, yet finally aware,